We'll begin with the presentation from Joel, and then I'll let Martin discuss the paper, and then we'll follow on from there. So Joel McKim, he's a senior lecturer in digital media and culture and the director of the Vasari Research Centre for Art and Technology at Birkbeck in University of London. So Joel, please feel very welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Very nice to be here. Let me try to share this. Yes, my talk is entitled AI in the City, Confronting Facial Recognition, which is a relatively new topic for me, but I thought it was particularly appropriate for this discussion. So apologies to Martin for not giving him a lot of notice with the paper, but I look forward to his response nonetheless. I thought it was particularly appropriate to talk about facial recognition for a number of reasons. Firstly, from an economic perspective, facial recognition has, according to a Stanford study, become the third largest sector in the burgeoning artificial intelligence industry in terms of global investment, trailing only autonomous vehicles and the health sector, which we heard about earlier. It's garnering close to $4.7 billion in investment in 2019. Secondly, it has proven to be one of the most successful deployments of AI and computer vision technologies, perhaps problematically so. And thirdly, partly due to this effectiveness, it is currently an extremely active site of legal and political contestation. So I think we'll have lots to discuss on that front. I'm obviously not a legal scholar, but I did my best to look at some of the kind of legal frameworks that are developing around these technologies. So I'd like to begin by briefly sketching some of the technical developments that have led to the expanded presence of facial recognition technologies before turning to that legal and political implications and situation. So the current deep learning enabled wave of facial recognition follows from an earlier algorithmic breakthrough in this area of research, which is still relatively recent. The facial detection algorithm developed by Paul Viola and Michael Jones in 2001, known as the Viola-Jones algorithm, was a game changer in the success rate of computer vision approaches. The algorithm scans images using simple rectangular shapes, known as HAR features, that compare pixel intensity between different regions of the image. For example, a common characteristic of the human face is that the region of the eyes is darker than the region of the cheeks, and therefore the corresponding HAR feature for face detection is a set of two adjacent rectangles that lie above the eye and the cheek region. While effective at face detection, the Viola-Jones algorithm is limited in terms of distinguishing between faces or more advanced forms of facial analysis. The turn to deep learning approaches represented the next significant sea change in facial recognition techniques, in particular the use of convolutional neural networks, or CNNs. The CNN passes a grid of pixel values, called a kernel, across an image one section at a time, detecting first simple features like edges and lines, and working up to more complex layers of feature recognition, such as eyes and ears, and eventually to complete faces. So you have these layers of the neural network that gradually build up to more and more complex object detection, in this case, face detection. Through a process of backpropagation, the CNN gradually refines the values of its kernel grids and increases the accuracy of its pattern recognition. Neural network enables systems to become extremely powerful at both face detection and analysis. Just a 4x4 pixel image of a face is enough information for quite accurate facial detection. An 11x11 pixel image can produce an approximate 3D model of a face, and 100x100 pixel image is more than enough information to recognize human activities, age, and controversially, emotion. Convolutional neural networks require images to learn, and lots of them. And it's at this stage of training that labeled data sets, often called ground truth data, become crucial. So ImageNet, arguably the most significant computer vision training set, was unveiled in 2009. by a team of researchers at Stanford and Princeton, led by Professor Fei Li, who once described the project as an attempt, quote, to map out the entire world of objects. The dataset now consists of more than 14 million images, often scraped from online photo sharing sites like Flickr, and tagged by a crowdsourced army of workers into over 20,000 categories. In the domain of facial recognition, celebrities have played an unwittingly key role, as the high number of identified images available makes them perfect source material for facial recognition training. The Microsoft Celeb database, launched in 2016, contained over 10 million images of nearly 100,000 individuals, and those individuals actually included several prominent data rights activists like Gillian York, for example. Before it was taken offline in 2019, following investigative reports by the Financial Times and others. So it's at the level of the data set we encountered the first of many important grounds for legal and ethical consideration, particularly around the question of image rights. In investigative projects like Megapixels and Exposing AI, the designers and activists Adam Harvey and Jules Laplace have investigated the source of images contained in prominent recognition datasets. In examining Megaface, for example, a public data set from the University of Washington, Harvey and Laplace found that 69% of more than 3 million images taken from Flickr were extracted from accounts that prohibited commercial use, and that all images required some form of attribution, of which none was provided by the Megaface dataset, nor any of the research projects that used it, which included commercial projects. Harvey and Laplace suggest this would amount to over 3 million violations of Creative Commons licenses for each commercial use of the dataset if it were to be enforced. The questionable use of public image data for the purposes of compiling training data sets has led AI researchers to begin to turn to alternative ways of training AI models, such as the use of what's called synthetic data, so rendered CGI images used in the place of digital photographs. The recent SynFace project is one example of this for researchers in China and Australia. And in this case, they're using GAN-produced, AI-produced images of faces for their training. So you have this kind of circular effect where you have AI produced images training other AI systems, and you get this kind of circuitous pattern. As similarly to what Francesca was speaking about earlier, the frequent claims of racial and gender bias leveled at facial recognition technologies are closely tied to the specific characteristics of these image data sets. The concern is that the underrepresentation of minorities within the public image repositories scraped for training data sets may lead to higher error rates and higher false positive identifications for these demographic groups. For example, the labeled faces in the wild data set, an important benchmark for facial recognition training, was estimated to be nearly 78% male and roughly 84% white. An important and much cited 2018 study by Joy Boulamwini and Timnit Gebru analyzed commercial gender classification systems from Microsoft, IBM, and Megvie's Face++, and found that rates of misclassification were up to 35 times higher for darker skinned women as they were for white men. So one of the material outcomes of these advances in AI-powered facial recognition systems is an expanding ecology of commercial companies, both big tech, but also small startups, which are promising an array of applications of these technologies, from police surveillance to tracking of vulnerable Alzheimer patients, for example. Understandably, the deployment of facial recognition technologies by police and border authorities has been of particular concern. Without restrictions, the potential overreach or misuse of these systems is clearly enormous. Researchers at Georgetown University, for example, estimated in 2016 that 1 out of every 2 Americans is already in a face recognition database accessible to law enforcement. At the level of large corporations, a public backlash has had some impact, actually. The use of Amazon's facial recognition service recognition by police forces and the company's reported pitch to Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, drew particular public outrage and has led to the company declaring a moratorium on the use of its technology by the police and customs. Microsoft has declared a similar ban on working with police, and IBM has actually pulled out of facial recognition development entirely. Amazon is, however, still the parent company of Ring, the video doorbell system, which constitutes the largest civilian surveillance system ever produced. Since purchasing Ring in 2018, Amazon has brokered over 1,800 partnerships with local law enforcement agencies who can request recorded video content from Ring users without a warrant. The company claims that no facial recognition software is used within the Ring devices, but that doesn't preclude law enforcement from using facial recognition technologies after the fact on the available video footage. The company has also patented a surveillance as service initiative, which would allow customers to purchase surveillance footage captured by its planned fleet of aerial delivery drones. So this may be a kind of image of the future, potentially. So the departure of big tech from some areas of the facial recognition industry has left a gap that many smaller companies are only too eager to fill. In the US, companies like Clearview AI, TrueFace, AnyVision, Effectiva, Kairos, Accenture all continue to secure police contracts and, of course, other developments. The growing reach of these companies has led to digital rights advocacy groups in the US, such as Fight for the Future, to call for a total ban on the use of facial recognition technologies by both private companies and federal law enforcement. And activists have also attempted to reignite interest in the Facial Recognition and Biometric Technology Moratorium Act, legislation banning government use of biometric technology proposed by several senators and congresspeople in the US. The context of the pandemic has provided a PR opportunity of sorts for the facial recognition industry to improve its reputation. Rob Watts, CEO of Tel Aviv-based Coresight AI, recently published, for example, an article on Forbes' website entitled "Smart Cities: How Facial Recognition Can Facilitate the Safe Return to Urban Life," promoting the use of facial recognition to enable a post-COVID urban resurgence. Seemingly anticipating the public resistance, Coresight's corporate tagline is "Coresight Facial Recognition, a Force for Good," and the company claims it adheres to GDPR and regional privacy compliance. Many AI companies, like the Linköping, Sweden-based Visage, promise visual analytics tools such as sentiment or affective analysis alongside facial recognition or detection capabilities. Amongst the facial analysis applications Visage promotes is driver monitoring of facial expressions to detect signs of anger, fear, and other emotions that can affect the driver's perception. It's their quote. As the designer Simone Niquil has identified, the majority of facial analysis systems claiming to measure emotions quite uncritically adopt the facial action coding system, a taxonomy for visible facial expressions established by psychologists Paul Ekman and Wallace Friesen in 1978, drawing from earlier work actually by the Swedish anatomist Carl Hermann Hjortzio. Apologies for the pronunciation. Here we see Visage incorporating, so the system works through cataloging a series of these facial action units, small facial movements that can together be added up to supposedly represent a clear measurement of emotions. So here we see Visage incorporating the 6 emotions that Ekman suggested were universally experienced in all humans. disgust, fear, joy, surprise, anger, and sadness. Companies like the Tel Aviv-based Faceception go one step further, claiming to be the, quote, first to technology and first to market with proprietary computer vision and machine learning technology for profiling people and revealing their personality based only on their facial image. A company that's promoting itself in advertising and public space quite widely in London at the moment is called Hads Up, which combines or claims to combine facial recognition technologies with hologram technology in public advertisements. So the company will monitor the faces of passersby, identifying mood, attention, gender, age, and so on in order to tailor ads to their demographics. And the kinds of demographics that the company lists on their website are a little bit worrying, including ethnicity and the not very well explained social grades. So it gives some kind of sense of where this could all be going. One of my particular interests, and I think Martin's as well, is our artistic or design responses to this situation. So just very briefly, a number of artists have tried to confront this situation in critical and creative ways. So Adam Harvey and Jules Laplace, who I mentioned earlier, have, for example, a web-based app called Deface, which uses some of these computer vision and facial recognition algorithms to offer redaction services. So you can upload an image and it will automatically redact the faces from the image. Zach Glass has a number of projects that can confront some of these technologies. So his face cages represent the abstract violence of the biometric diagrams used to categorize faces, often disproportionately impacting non-normative and minoritarian people. His facial weaponization suite was for a series of masks, which were composite information from biometric facial data from particular groups to create this amorphous mask, which could be used to block facial recognition technologies. And Heather Dewey-Harburg's piece, How Do You See Me, tried to, in some ways, better understand the black box of facial recognition neural networks. So she produced a generative algorithm which would produce kind of random images and presented those images to a facial recognition system trained to detect her own face. And so these images, which to the human eye look nothing like, the artists obviously, some of them were picked up by the system. So it begins to identify how exactly neural networks are reading images, the kinds of, for our eyes, kind of abstract forms which they are able to identify as faces. So having highlighted some of the current applications and resistances to these AI and computer vision enabled technologies, I'd like to conclude by outlining the current legal landscape, as best as I'm able to do, surrounding the regulation and adoption of facial recognition technologies in Europe. Here I reference largely the in-depth analysis report produced in September of this year by the European Parliamentary Research Service, EPRS, on regulating facial recognition in the EU, which evaluates the current situation in light of the European Commission's proposal for an EU Artificial Intelligence Act unveiled in April 2021, which we heard about earlier as well. While the EU appears to be taking the threats of facial recognition technologies to human rights more seriously than many governing bodies, it has to be said, there of course remain a number of legal concerns and limitations to consider. One overall problem is that the relevant rules governing problems of facial recognition and AI more generally are spread across multiple levels of the EU legal framework, presenting potential complications to actual implementation. Whereas the fundamental rights to data protection, privacy, and non-discrimination are established at the primary level of the Charter of Fundamental Rights, the upholding of these rights in practice is still in the process of being established. Governing the manufacture and deployment of emerging technologies in relation to fundamental rights more often falls to secondary legislation, such as the Law Enforcement Directive or the General Data Protection Regulation. There are substantial concerns that the scope of secondary legislation may be inappropriately narrow and may involve inappropriately high thresholds for establishing protection. And I think it's interesting that a lot of these companies are very, very explicit, say, well, we answer to GDPR regulations. They don't seem to find that difficult to do in some ways. A legitimate fear exists that new forms of algorithmic discrimination are simply not effectively covered by existing legislation. How, for example, can GDPR principles of data transparency be applied to the black box processes of facial recognition neural networks? And to what extent does an individual have a right to an explanation of the decision reached after algorithmic assessment? As the EPRS report states, quote, absent comparative reference points and due to speeds, scales, and levels of complexity that defy human understanding, algorithmic decisions may appear legitimate and the victim may not become aware of discrimination in the first place. At first glance, the European Commission's proposed EU regulatory framework on AI appears to take an appropriately cautious stance on the use of biometric technologies, and the European Parliament has considered moratoriums on the use of facial recognition in public spaces and for use by law enforcement. The European Commission's proposed AI framework classifies AI systems according to risk level and distinguishes between real-time and post-remote biometric identification systems. Proposing to prohibit, for example, quote, the use of AI systems for real-time or live remote biometric identification of natural persons in publicly accessible spaces for the purpose of law enforcement. But the distinction between high-risk or low-risk facial recognition system remains far from self-evident, and even otherwise prohibited high-risk facial recognition systems even otherwise prohibited high-risk applications carry a number of exceptions for reasons of public security, searching for potential victims of crime, prevention of substantial threat to the life or physical safety of persons or of a terrorist threat, detection of an individual suspected of a criminal offense. And the decision on whether to implement these potentially wide-ranging fields of exceptions is left to member states to determine at the level of national law. Biometric categorization systems, defined in the framework as, quote, AI systems having the purpose of assigning natural persons to specific categories such as sex, age, hair color, eye color, tattoos, ethnic origin, or sexual or political orientation on the basis of biometric data, are not explicitly classified as high-risk use of biometrics, interestingly. So, except in the law enforcement domain, would only be subject to transparency measures and require that the persons exposed be informed of their use. The potential intrusion of these systems of categorization into the public life of the city and the possible discriminatory practices they might engender, I think is not difficult to imagine. And I think, you know, we see a couple of examples already of in the presentation of companies who are eager to deploy these kinds of categorization systems for everything from advertisement to employee surveillance. While EU regulations on facial recognition and other AI technologies are clearly flawed, the situation here in the UK is considerably worse, I think we have to say. On the 10th of December 2021, the UK's Department for Digital Culture, Media and Sport issued a consultation entitled Data, A New Direction on potential revisions to the UK's data protection regime. It's the first post-Brexit review of the GDPR in the UK, and the UK government sees it as an opportunity to create a more, quote, pro-growth and pro-innovation data regime, whilst maintaining the UK's world-leading data protection standards. So I think this is a slightly ominous direction. and already the UK doesn't have a great track record in terms of research research ethics in this area. So this is, for example, a major research project located at the Surrey University, but sponsored by the Home Office, but also funded in part by the Chinese government for facial recognition technologies, which were used in Hong Kong in order to attempt to identify masked protesters in the Hong Kong protests. So just to finally conclude, ultimately, it may be at the level of city governance that the risks of AI technologies like facial recognition are effectively confronted. One example is the Global Observatory on Urban AI project, led by Barcelona, London, and Amsterdam, and developing out of the larger Cities Coalition for Digital Rights initiative. The project has recently published a report entitled AI Ethics in Policy and Action, City Governance of Algorithmic Decision Systems, and is currently preparing a report on the use of facial recognition technologies in public space. London's representative on the project, the city's first chief digital officer, Theo Blackwell, has called for a ban on the use of facial recognition technologies by private companies in public space. And Barcelona Deputy Mayor Leah Bonet has argued for an outright European-wide ban to biometric recognition systems. The ability of city-level organizations like the Global Observatory to influence EU regulations by, for example, gaining a seat on the proposed European Artificial Intelligence Board remains to be seen. I'll conclude there.
Thank you, Joel. That was, of course, uncanny in many ways to listen to, but also extremely inspiring and thought-provoking. So without further ado, I'm going to invite the discussant for this session, that is Martin Zeilinger. And Martin is Senior Lecturer in Computational Arts and Technology at Abertay University. I won't say much more, but please, Martin, the floor is yours.
Hi, thanks so much. Can you see my screen okay and hear me all right?
Great.
Very good, okay. First of all, I want to just quickly say thank you so much, Marima and also Bowman, for the invitation, and thanks to Carla for helping with a lot of organizational matters. And thanks to Joel for this really insightful and really interesting paper that I look forward to having a bit of a discussion about. What I'll do actually is pick up directly where Joel left off, specifically with this observation that ultimately it may be at the level of city governance that risks identified in association to AI technologies like facial recognition might be most effectively confronted. And so I want to frame my own presentation with an example of a failed smart city experiment that I think holds some quite interesting issues for discussion later on. And then I want to move on to a brief critical discussion of ImageNet, one of the databases that Joel also mentioned. And I'll do that with reference to a critical artistic intervention that engaged with that data set. Quickly, the slide, a couple of the things that I will touch on. Smart city projects, I already mentioned that. I'll be overall interested in how we can foster critical literacies regarding facial recognition technologies. And an important concern that I have in this context is how we may keep the very complicated entanglements between privacy and IP issues in this domain human legible. In other words, maybe how can we ourselves and also the public more generally maybe learn how to see like a machine, which is something I would argue is required in order to really understand a lot of the critical implications of these technologies. So in 2017, the city of Toronto, where I lived for 14 years, announced a partnership with a private company, Sidewalk Labs. And Sidewalk Labs is owned by Alphabet, which is, of course, Google's parent corporation. And the company focuses on developing and implementing so-called smart city solutions. For over a decade, Toronto has been the city with the most rapid growth in high price, pretty much unaffordable condominium development anywhere in the world. The city also features the remnants of some very short-sighted urban planning in the form of large swaths of industrial areas that cut off the city from its waterfront, and many of which are now disused. And this means overall that the formerly industrial lakefront of Toronto holds some of the most valuable property development real estate anywhere in the world. Sidewalk Labs won a proposal to develop a 12-acre section of the eastern waterfront. And later it was also found out through some leaks that the proposal left also a possibility of developing as many as 800 acres of further city portland in the following years. The project was pitched as a tool for addressing affordability and transportation issues in the city. It was meant to yield one of the world's first full-featured smart cities that would incorporate environmentally conscious design and emerging technologies to accelerate urban innovation, serve as a beacon for cities around the world. And Sidewalk Labs intended to build initially roughly 2,500 housing units, and about half of them were meant to become available to the public below market value to rent or own. Very quickly, resistance mounted among the city's social justice, data privacy, and governance activists. And the central concern of these groups was that the new neighborhood developed by Sidewalk Labs would literally be a lab, a laboratory in which inhabitants would become guinea pigs for Google-run experiments in collecting, harvesting, and appropriating a myriad of citizen-produced, immensely valuable data points. These data points would become part of datasets owned by Alphabet and or black boxed in patented AI technologies. And they would also be sold potentially to third-party innovators in AI-based smart city tech. Here are some of the features of the proposed neighborhood. For example, it would include sensor-enabled park benches, which might count how many people came to sit on them each hour, where they had come from, and what they would do after they left. Curbside trash cans with the ability to alert the sanitation department when they were full. And of course, thousands of cameras that would track movements in and across the neighborhood and correlate these with transportation, shopping, and consumption patterns. An integrated, largely invisible digital layer would also underpin the full gamut of civic services, including the evaluation of existing infrastructure and further urban planning, monitoring mass transit and road infrastructure, and measuring the efficiency of utility systems, of social services, and even of healthcare. In a blog post, a Toronto tech entrepreneur who had interviewed for a job with Sidewalk Labs said that he had been asked for his ideas about integrating smart city technologies with voting systems. Problematically, ownership of the data and insights gleaned from it would sit with Sidewalk Labs and would serve as the basis for the development of what one critic called a sort of urban operating system that could then be exported to other cities. A group called BlockSidewalk was quickly formed to oppose the development. Its concerns ranged from the lack of transparency in the way Toronto Waterfront had awarded the contract to doubts about whether the firm actually had proven track record in delivering such an ambitious project. Additionally, leaked documents, as I noted, suggested that the Google affiliate wanted to build a much larger neighborhood, also provide transportation for it, and in return for its investment asked the city council for a share in property taxes, development fees, and the increased value of city land that would normally go to the city. What's key here is that in the rhetoric around which protest and resistance was organized, different social and legal issues became more and more blurred and were kind of bleeding into one another. While data privacy concerns were at the surface the most urgent issue, many other related issues also circulated, including the city council's diminishing data sovereignty, the privatization of governance, and its subsequent potential algorithmic automation, and also the individual agency of citizens and inhabitants. All of this culminated in a concern with data ownership, and also, where the discussion was more conceptual in nature, with a concern regarding how data access becomes subject to various discursive simplifications of property rights. Bianca Weil, Wiley, the figurehead of the activist group, frequently highlighted how the privatization and commercial exploitation of user data was really the ultimate goal of the project. As she said, I quote, "The archiving of both individualized and aggregate data to build products and services to then sell back to us. Why is that not intellectual property? And the value of that data, why is that not ours as residents of the city?" While this perspective somewhat simplifies things, Wiley raises a very valid point here. What Sidewalk Labs was proposing was a complex data ecology in which citizens produce data that is then appropriated by corporate actors with the purpose of developing proprietary data sets that in turn can feed patented AI systems, all with the ultimate goal of innovating and developing smart city solutions that the city council itself would then have to buy back as services from the company. The activist community essentially perceived the danger of the city becoming a client state of private tech corporate giants. The city would become a kind of data cow of Google, constantly milked for valuable information. And individuals living in corresponding smartified areas would resemble really fully disowned data bodies with no agency or sense of ownership concerning the information their own behaviors would produce in urban environments. Pretty soon, the company's chief privacy consultant, Anne Cavokian, who had formerly been the province of Ontario's privacy commissioner, resigned from Sidewalk Labs and wrote in a public letter, "I imagined us creating a smart city of privacy, not a smart city of surveillance." Other critical voices chimed in, linking the problematic privacy implications to the underlying intellectual property-oriented issues. Invoking Shoshana Zuboff's work, Robert McNamee wrote, I quote, "The Smart City project on the Toronto waterfront is the most highly involved version to date of surveillance capitalism, and it will allow Google to use algorithms to nudge human behavior in ways to favor its business. No matter what Google is offering, the value to Toronto cannot possibly approach the value your city is giving up," he wrote. "This is a dystopian vision that has no place in a democratic society," end of quote. The terms invoked here of ownership, value, business, and so on, clarify quite beautifully that in any smart city scenario, issues of privacy and governance are intimately entangled with perceived issues of property rights. To cut a long story short, the entire project was ultimately scrapped in May 2020. This happened when, in response to mounting criticism and activist resistance, the city council imposed so many restrictions on Sidewalk Labs that Google ultimately didn't find the project economically feasible anymore. What initially looked like a deal worth an estimated 3 billion Canadian dollars in real estate development and untold further billions in smart city tech to be developed on the basis of the harvested data, all of it evaporated into thin air because the parent company ended up being unable to secure the rights to own and commercially exploit the data in question. Underneath the promised innovation and benefits of living in a futuristic, comprehensively implemented smart city, what emerged were thick layers of dubious data appropriation and commercialization. Living in the neighborhood designed by Sidewalk Labs would not have meant just to be living in a lab. Really, it would also have been like living on a proprietary platform in the sense of Nick Cernicek's concept of platform capitalism. And ultimately, such an experience could also be likened to living really kind of inside an involving mega data set, a matrix of sorts in which private and public life becomes similar to the labor of Amazon Turks, in the sense that each encounter between inhabitant and the vast ecology of cameras and sensors is not only life as such, but also the labor of producing valuable data points. But let me bring this back more directly to facial recognition technologies. What strikes me as most important in this context about the Toronto activist stance against Sidewalk Labs is that those involved in organizing the protests understood extremely well how complex and multifaceted AI-driven big data analysis is, and how deeply layered the potential surveillance apparatus underlying it can be. What they pointed out frequently is that tech companies' plans for data collection in public spaces far outpace citizens' ability to comprehend the implications. as well as government's ability to regulate the mostly black-boxed proprietary technologies that could be developed on the basis of that data. This imbalance relates to the fear that the critical implications of massive-scale smart city implementations are, in fact, unknowable for non-specialists, or perhaps any human individual. Just like, as James Bridle argues, global scale computation cannot be meaningfully grasped by human cognition, so the intricate entanglement of sensors, algorithmic systems, automated bureaucracies, and infrastructure that form the underpinnings of a smart city are effectively incomprehensible for individual inhabitants. For this reason, the activist community quite strongly focused on camera surveillance and facial recognition technologies, kind of as placeholders for smart city technologies that are less visible. This approach worked really quite well, and for me, it exemplifies the porous boundaries between privacy concerns and ownership concerns. To greatly simplify the perspective frequently adopted, cameras in a way are felt to be capable of stealing images without consent. They capture our souls, as it were, and perceived rights in the ownership of one's image are thus easily violated. I think that for campaigns such as BlockSidewalk, facial recognition is so important because it is a visible aspect of how AI interacts with human agents, and also oftentimes a quite visible aspect of how it acts upon them. In a very real sense, in an environment of tech development that forever inches closer to unknowability and unexplainability, facial recognition forms a crucially important interface between algorithmic systems and human users, precisely because it tends to be quite visible. What this notion encapsulates is a problem that I've also considered in some of my other research. In order to begin to understand and grasp the critical implications of the ways in which facial recognition makes human identity and human behavior machine readable, a tactic of key importance may be to switch things around and to learn how to see like a machine. In other words, in order to foster any critical awareness regarding the machine readability of human behaviors, we have to insist on the human legibility of machine learning data and AI behaviors. In activist contexts such as the BlockSidewalks campaign, focusing on facial recognition in relation to AI, privacy, and data ownership issues, this is a great starting point for increasing critical literacy regarding AI. And this may be required to subvert and what may be required here is to subvert and instrumentalize the kind of computational thinking that is also underpinning facial recognition itself. And by computational thinking, I mean the application of computational logic to efforts of solving difficult problems, such as identifying individuals from brief or partial encounters. Overall, computational thinking goes far beyond a basic understanding of algorithmic processes as methods for solving problems that are suited for computer implementation. It can also pander to generalizing assumptions concerning the abstractability and programmability of human behavior in ways that tend to ignore or overlook crucial political issues, as we know from the work of Catherine Hales, Wendy Chun, Ed Finn, and many others. Computational thinking is often negatively connoted, but with regard to facial recognition, learning to see like a machine can also help us better align our ability to imagine computational processes better, and consequently also to imagine and oppose adjacent algorithmic governance issues, privacy issues, or data ownership issues. In my monograph that I published recently earlier this year, I discussed one example of this, specifically an art project, a collaboration between Kate Crawford and Trevor Paglen called ImageNet Roulette from 2019, which demonstrates some of these points quite well. The project utilizes mainstream image recognition technology in order to make biases that are inherent in the data used for machine learning human legible. The project also articulates a powerful critique of how agency and cultural ownership are construed in and through such technology. ImageNet Roulette took the form of a simple web interface that invited users to upload a self-portrait, which would then be evaluated and interpreted by a purpose-built image recognition system. The system had been trained on the ImageNet dataset that Joel mentioned as well, which is, as he mentioned, an open access compilation of roughly 14 million labeled images that actually also include many portraits of individuals. And this continues to be widely used by researchers, government agencies, and in corporate contexts for the development of machine vision applications. The experience of interacting with ImageNet Roulette resembled popular personality quiz apps that continue to circulate on social media. So in return for private user information, such apps tend to offer some spectacularizing or exhilarating feedback, such as astrological advice or pseudo-psychological profiles. And almost always such offerings disguise ulterior motives of data extraction for commercial or political purposes. In the case of ImageNet Roulette, a user's reward for uploading an image of themselves was to have the image analyze and label the uploaded image. The intention behind ImageNet Roulette was that as part of this evaluation process, it would become clear to the user that beyond the artifice of presumptively objective computational analysis, AI systems are in fact deeply saturated with human bias. The subjectivity ingrained and the extreme bias ingrained in the ImageNet dataset through the humans who labeled its contents meant, for example, that a photograph of a woman smiling in a bikini might be classified as in the example given, oh no, that's on the next slide, as a slattern, a slovenly woman, trollop. Or to give another example, in a review of the project for The Guardian, a journalist of Asian descent found herself identified by the software as a gook, slant eye. By subjecting users to this kind of system-inherent offensive feedback, ImageNet Roulette very successfully managed to challenge popular assumptions regarding the presumptively objective and interpretive validity of computational processes. It managed to expose these processes, which are commonly not human readable, and to raise awareness of the exploitative labor practices behind biased labeling. And more importantly, it also raised ownership issues related to the dataset compilation practices. Overall, the project made it easy for non-specialist users to grasp that algorithmic systems can powerfully deny human users their own agency. In the case of this project, the evaluations received in response to uploading an image often violated a user's sense of ownership with regard to their self-image, identity, and the interpretation thereof. In publications and promotional material framing the project, Crawford and Paglin additionally raised awareness concerning the potential misappropriation of image content that circulates online, specifically with regard to the web scraping of dataset contents, a practice that frequently exploits legal loopholes in existing IP frameworks. Again, ImageNet Roulette approaches the subject tactically by emulating the functionality of popular online tools offering free services in return for permission to use private user data. While ImageNet Roulette itself was explicit about not retaining copies of uploaded images, the project format nevertheless drew attention to image ownership questions concerning the underlying dataset. For example, while the operators of ImageNet, which is maintained by Princeton and Stanford universities, while they state that they do not hold copyrights in any of the images in the dataset, this does not mean that the individuals captured in the dataset images have actually consented to their use. Originally, online documentation for the project also noted that ImageNet recognizes copyrights held in the images in their original resolution, but this also implies that the institutions maintaining the project may well claim ownership in the collections of lower resolution thumbnails with which labels and classifiers are paired, or likewise in the compilation of URLs linking back to the original images. Additionally, the project website clarifies that copies of all images in the dataset are kept on non-public servers where they can be made available upon request for certain non-commercial and or educational uses. Within less than a year of the project's release, hundreds of thousands of portraits and image descriptors were being removed from the ImageNet dataset, at which point the art project was then taken offline. The achievements of ImageNet Roulette consists in the efficiency with which the project configured the existing functionality of ImageNet into a powerful critique of underlying technologies of image recognition, as well as in the impact that the project had on public perceptions of dataset bias and the awareness it raised concerning data ownership. As such, the project exemplifies how artistic approaches can disturb, complicate, and contest problematic ideological figurations of AI, for example, with regard to underlying privacy and IP issues. In concluding, I want to bring this back to some of the points that Joel raised, but also to the failed Sidewalk Labs project in Toronto, and then maybe open this up towards some additional questions. Like ImageNet Roulette, the BlockSidewalk campaign managed to foment resistance to the appropriation and commercial exploitation of image data that can occur on the basis of facial recognition and similar machine vision technologies. We can think of facial recognition and of its interfacing with urban populations as the visible face, or the facade, if you will, of a more complex underlying web of integrated algorithmic systems that sense, evaluate, categorize, quantify, interpret, and document communities of human agents. This tends to happen, ostensibly, with the stated aim of safeguarding or improving the lives of those individuals. But in fact, it also happens on the premise that an inevitable side effect is the recording and archiving of mass amounts of data, as well as the analysis of this data by way of proprietary algorithmic systems and protocols, so that insights gleaned from the data can then form the basis for the promised improvements. All of this amounts to a broad-scale disenfranchisement of individuals with regard to the individual, collective, or cultural ownership of their own data bodies, for the creation of services, which can, once appropriated, no doubt be refashioned into commercial products, really. In the case of smart city projects, such services are then very likely to be offered back to urban communities, and city councils can then subscribe or buy these services at great expense. And the citizen subjects involved in all of this would really, I think, pay very dearly, both in commercial and in privacy terms, for the privileges and ostensible improvements afforded through the appropriation of their data images and data bodies into these massive schemes. An interesting question that remains for me is where and how these concerns touch down in the legal domain. I would say that the important contribution of critical discourse in legal theory and also policymaking is to ensure that the kind of visibility that is needed for human agents and communities to be able to understand and then perhaps also counteract facial recognition and machine vision technologies, that this can remain in place. This means working against the black boxing of data sets, against the making proprietary of all kinds of machine vision protocols, so that complicated entanglements of privacy and IP issues remain human legible, and so that human agents can perhaps continue to learn how to see like machines in order to keep in check problematic AI development and data issues. And I will leave it there. Thanks.